Saigo, Bojo, Tansei. It's a pleasure for me to be here this morning. In some ways, I'm very much looking forward to my speaking to you. In other ways, I'm terrified because my job is to ask you to give up some of your most cherished beliefs about treaty and to think about new facts about things that you've never even dreamed about, but that you certainly wish would be in place. So it's going to be a challenge, and particularly so because in many respects what has happened until now is a tragedy. Now this presentation is also about 4 different parties. The first parties were your great-great-great-grandparents who entered into Treaty 5. Sovereign people, self-governing, self-determining, very proud and very capable people for whom you would not be here were it not for them. And then the others are the Crown of Great Britain and Ireland, the settler government of John A. Macdonald and his successors, and about you. Because you are the great-great-great-grandchildren of the people who entered into Treaty 5. But first, we have to unlearn most of what we already know. We have to unlearn so that we can learn. For the last 150 years, the central goal of Canada's Aboriginal policy was to eliminate Indigenous government, to act as if Indigenous people had no rights, to terminate the treaties, and through a process of assimilation to cause you to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada. It tried to do all these things, every single one of them. A country that engages in cultural genocide seeks out to destroy the political and social institutions of the targeted group. We're talking about destroying the whole thing of your great-great-great-grandparents. Land is seized. Populations are forcibly transferred. Their movement is restricted. Languages are banned. Spiritual leaders are persecuted. Spiritual practices are forbidden. Objects of spiritual value are confiscated and destroyed. Families are disrupted to prevent the transmission of cultural values, identity, and history from one generation to the next. And Canada did all those things. How could that have happened? Well, it's very simple. From the very beginning, the settlers that took over Canada engaged in an intentional campaign of deception, which has now become embedded as Canada's official history. It is the history that you learned when you went to school. Those of you who are still in school are still learning it. It has been embedded from one generation to the next to the next. And the right questions are no longer being asked. The jurisprudence, what the courts have ruled over the last 150 years, the government policy for 150 years has created a new law, a new history, which conceals the true facts. The report of the Royal Commission of 1996 made its report in 1996, 22 years ago, said this. This is a Royal Commission. Mr. Professor Chartrand over there was one of the commissioners who made this report. Canada has been built on a foundation of false premises and institutionalized amnesia. The memory gone. Amnesia. Worthy newcomers came from Europe and discovered unoccupied land. The inhabitants that they found here were wild, ignorant, savage people with strange and ungodly practices. That over time, the settlers' example that would appreciate the settlers' superior wisdom gradually became civilized, or they would be left behind in the march of progress, anthropological footnotes in history. A country cannot be built on a living lie. And that's the problem Canada has today, of trying to reconcile what happened into a good, positive relationship, and it doesn't fit, because what they are asking you to recognize is not true. We've all been deceived. And our task today, your task, my task, all of us, is to find the true facts, make them known, and to change the course of history to one that is honorable and a good foundation, a good future for all of us. The two-row wampum is very simple. It's two purple rows on a white background. And the story is that the Dutch came to probably the Iroquois at that time and said, we've got an idea. We're getting along pretty well. We'll be your fathers and you'll be our children and we'll live together as a family. And of course, the indigenous people laughed at that idea and they said, no, we're going to be brothers and sisters. We'll live together still as a family, but equal side. You take all your people and put them in your ship on one row. We'll take all our people and we'll put them in our canoe on our side. Our language, our religion, our way of life, everything. You take all of your stuff, you put them on your ship, and we'll sail down the river together, side by side and in peace. And if ever either of us needs help, we can ask the other one and we'll help each other. That's the two-row wampum. And the Royal Proclamation then goes on to say that no private person can purchase land from the Indians, because that was what the trouble was. Someone would pay someone some money and they'd say that land is ours, and then there'd be problems. And so to allow proper settlement, that if at any time the Indians should be inclined to dispose of said lands, inclined to dispose, the same shall be purchased only for us in our name of the Crown, at some public meeting or assembly of the said Indians. In other words, the Royal Proclamation sets out the rules that the British Empire must follow in order to enter into a treaty. Lands must be, you want to discuss a treaty, you must obtain free, prior, and informed consent of the Indians to be able to have that land. And lands must be compensated for. This is a part of the Constitution of Canada. The Royal Proclamation is a document that Canada must obey. So, in 1864, when the settlers decided, we've got this PEI and we've got Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and all that, we ought to confederate and become some kind of a super colony. And what they were really after was the riches of what they called Rupert land, and what you all called, your ancestors, called our land. So the leaders of the colonies went over to England and they met with Queen Victoria. And they said, we've got this idea of creating this super colony over there in North America. And we would like to get those lands that were just on white on that map, all of that land. We'd like that to become a part of Canada. Queen Victoria replied, sorry, these lands might be British North America, but the Indians have the title to the land. And we do not have any treaty with the tribes and nations who inhabit it. If you want those lands to be a part of Canada, you must obtain their consent. Their consent. So that is why the Crown, with all of its great glory and sovereignty and power and armies and navies, recognized indigenous sovereignty. Your sovereignty. The Crown knew that it did not have the sovereignty that's called dominion, where you can tell someone else what to do. And it knew that the territory involved was not a part of Canada until treaty. I mandate that treaties will be negotiated in my name and under my supervision for the sole purpose of immigration and settlement with no mention of resources. Compensation must be paid and the treaties will be just and equitable. We now have two written legal opinions that say, yeah, that's the way it is. One of these legal opinions, interestingly enough, was asked for in 1982 by Treaty Number 8. They hired a lawyer then named Kent McNeil, who is just now retiring, and he wrote the legal opinion. It's been around all these times. And I got another legal opinion in 2012 saying the same thing. Now, what is settlement? Settlement means to take up one's residence in a place to inhabit. To settlement does not mean engage in forestry. Settlement does not mean put in a mine, put in an oil well, to take up lands and do nothing with them. The Crown has a choice with all your land in Treaty 5. They either take it up and pay for it, or it is still your land and under your jurisdiction. I mentioned this is what Kent McNeil says in his legal opinion. No claims to compensation for lands not required for settlement were envisioned because it must have been assumed that those lands would be left in the possession of the Indian tribes. It might even be contended that the condition limited the Canadian government's authority to negotiate surrenders of land actually required for settlement. This was so clear that in Treaties 1 and Treaty 2, it doesn't even mention hunting, fishing, or trapping. Doesn't even mention it. Treaty 3 slips it in, and Treaty 5 slips in something more. But it's not according to the orders of Queen Victoria. The validity of surrenders for other purposes may be open to question. Now, equitable principles. The treaty has to be equitable principles. What does that mean? It has to be fair, has to be just, has to be reasonable. That's the constitutional standard that the government of Canada must be held. This is an imperative order of the Crown. Treaties must be obeyed, and the validity of the government's conduct is open to challenge. The summary: only for settlement, fair compensation must be paid. All other lands still, quote, belong to the Indians, and resources were not included in the treaty.